The fact that they have these three legs, the health, the environment, and ethics, makes for this, what I sometimes refer to that as a three-legged stool. It's pretty hard to kick over a three-legged stool. If you take one of those legs out, you can kick it over pretty quickly. But the three legs mean it's very hard to kick over, very hard to argue against, because you've got to do it on all fronts. The land cannot survive without animals on it. We would end up with desertified land that is dry and brittle, that has no nutrients in it, because the animals are essential for keeping that land, keeping the moisture in the soil, keeping the nutrients in the soil, keeping the carbon in the soil. We know that all agriculture is going to kill some animals, because to eat is to kill. Something must die for us to eat, no matter what it is that we eat.
Jayne, when it comes to advocating for eating a plant-only diet, there seems to be three different buckets where the arguments are going to fall under. One being the health benefits, two being the environmental benefits, and three being ethics. So we're going to take our time. We have a couple hours here and get through each of these, but I want to start with the health benefit piece, specifically nutrients. So when it comes to a plant-only diet, what specific nutrients are people going to be missing out on?
I think there's a pretty long list of nutrients. Most people know about B12, and that's the thing that gets discussed a lot because that isn't found in any animal source food, in any plant foods. But there are also other nutrients such as vitamin A, such as vitamin D3, the fatty acids, DHA and EPA, which are definitely not found in the right form in plants. So people think that you can get vitamin A from carrots, for instance. But what you're actually getting is beta carotene, and that has to be then converted into the form of vitamin A that the body can use. And a lot of people, at least half of us, don't have the capability of making that conversion, so that there becomes a difficulty in getting that vitamin. You'd get more of it from a slice of liver or from an egg or other animal source foods. So there's that list of nutrients, which is pretty important. I mean, you really can't undersell the importance of those things. EPA and DHA for the brain, for instance, are critical for functionality and health. You then get all these other nutrients which are found in small quantities and maybe hard to absorb, such as zinc and iron and lysine, leucine, and methionine, which are some of the essential amino acids that are found in proteins. And you get those in lesser amounts because they are present in lesser amounts in plants, but also because, again, the bioavailability is not as great. So there was a really good recent analysis done by Lily Nichols, who's a good RDN, who talks about the nutrition in pregnancy in particular. You're probably familiar with her work. I bet you've talked to her or planning to talk to her at some point. And she did a pictorial analysis recently of nutrients, of the nutrient iron. And she showed that to get bioavailable iron in the same quantity as you would get in, say, 1 ounce of clams or a small chicken thigh, you would have to eat 57 cups of broccoli. So that particular image conjures up, the reality of the mountains of food that you have to eat in order to match the nutrient availability in animal source foods, I think.
And when it comes to arguments for this diet and people advocating that they can still get their full nutrition from it when it comes to plant only, I feel like as you're explaining that, a big part of the confusion must come from the fact that some of these vitamins, you mentioned the beta carotene example, we can use that, the fact that they need to be converted to more usable forms. And to me, because of that, it allows for this argument to even take place. So it's important we're hashing that out. The fact that beyond beta carotene, there's other examples as well. Plants, even though they may contain a similar form of nutrition, a lot of times it needs to be converted to a different form for the body to utilize.
So vitamin D, D2, D3, for instance, is another example. So I think that this is almost the next frontier of understanding that we have to get into the public sphere, because food labeling will list certain vitamins, the priority vitamins that you're getting on certain foods and packaged foods or fresh foods or whatever. But it doesn't deal with that bioavailability conversion issue. And I think that that's really the next obligation of public health authorities to make sure that people understand that eating a carrot is not the same as eating an egg. You're not, it's you have to do more than that. So whether we will see that level of sophistication as we talk about nutrition going forward in the public sphere, I don't know. I really hope so. But at the moment, we're battling against a lot of other forces that are preventing that discussion.
I feel like another piece of this too that makes it tricky is the fact that if you are deficient in some of these key nutrients, a lot of times you're not going to feel it right away, or you're not going to develop a chronic disease right away. So you can be on these quote unquote alternative diets of only plants for periods of time and feel okay before you have any issues. So it makes it even more complicated in that way.
Absolutely. And again, this is very typical with B12. It can take 5 or more years for a deficiency to materialize, and you'll get some small symptoms perhaps early on. But then by the time you're into the full neurological effects, it might be 5, 6 years before you're seeing that. And also the measures. Chris Kresser does a lot of good analysis on this, that the way we measure B12 deficiency is not always very accurate. The standard tests that you get in doctors' offices, they're not measuring it accurately. So the level of deficiency is probably much greater than we imagine. And it's even, it's even significant in the omnivore population, but it is doubly, triply so in vegetarian and vegan populations.
Somebody tuning into this point might get the impression that, Jayne, you're somebody who's anti-plant. I want to be clear up front that you are an advocate for a well-balanced diet, including plants, and do find value in them. It's only in the extreme of eliminating meat and animal products that you find cause for worry.
Exactly. I'm a big fan of plants. Throughout most of my life, I probably ate more plants than animal foods. I had a bias towards plant-based eating. I never was exclusively plants, but I love them for most of my life. I started including animal source foods in my diet to a greater extent about 5 years ago. I would have had some, but I realized their importance about 5, 6 years ago. There's no question that there's that complementarity between the two sets of foods, and the vitamins and minerals in those foods interacts in a very, very complex way. It's very difficult to replicate that by popping a pill for the missing bits, because you never know whether you're getting the right amounts of other vitamins to allow that particular vitamin that you're taking to be absorbed properly and to be used by the body. So I do think that the two types of foods are complementary, and that you do run into trouble with a plant-based diet because you're cutting out so many nutrient-dense foods, but you're also getting an overload of some anti-nutrients probably. So if you're going to, for example, rely on spinach for your iron and not get it from any animal food sources, you might be tempted to eat a lot of spinach, cups and cups of it in smoothies and on your, with your dinner and whatever. And we know that spinach is high in oxalates. And oxalates have a particular it cause particular problems in the body, the most notable one being kidney stones, but also arthritic joints and gastro problems and different types of issues in different people. And it really does stand to reason that if you're only getting your vitamins from plants, you're going to maybe overdo it on some of them and on some of those anti-nutrients.
I'm so glad you came to the anti-nutrient piece. I was going to bring us around to that, but it's such an important point that I think is often understated when it comes to, debates, we'll say, between vegans and meat eaters. We're usually looking at it from how we started this conversation, what's missing from a plant-based diet, not what's in those plants that if they're consumed to a certain extent, can be problematic for the body. So you mentioned oxalates. Let's talk about some of the other ones that fall in this category.
Yeah. So there's phytic acid. So phytates are found in grains and nuts and seeds, for instance. And they can block absorption of zinc, for instance, to a very large degree. So much so that the World Health Organization adjusts its recommended daily amounts of zinc upwards in those countries where they don't have access to much meat and where their diet is heavily grain-based. So it's almost double the recommendation because they know that the body is not going to absorb all that zinc. So phytic acid is one of those. Lectins is something else which are found in many foods, nightshade vegetables, peanuts, a whole range of foods. And of course, the great lectin expert is Dr. Stephen Gundry. I think what the problem with all of these things is that knowledge in the general medical community is probably not very high. And therefore, if you were to ever go to a doctor with some complaints like arthritic ankles and, you can't digest properly, headaches, whatever, or a skin condition, for instance, they're very unlikely to say, oh, I bet that's a phytate or an oxalate problem or a lectin problem. So they won't go there unless they're particularly enlightened. And so, again, I think that the cause of some of conditions that are commonly taken to doctors is probably we understate the role of these anti-nutrients in causing those complaints. And I know of a particular case of a young boy who tried everything to get rid of a range of health issues and all over body conditions and aching muscles and could not function. And the only person that figured it out and put him on the road to health was Dr. Gundry. So because he's an expert and people have to find their way through to experts and to enlightened practitioners who are going to understand the impact of these foods.
When you talked about zinc there, you talked about it from needing more because of absorption. I want to put another layer on this where we have the layer of, do the plants contain that nutrient? Is it absorbed fully, plus the anti-nutrients? Mm-hmm. Plus, you also need to consider this other layer of having certain plants with animal-based products and interfering with the absorption of the nutrients in animal-based products on top of it all.
Right. That is exactly it. You've got those four layers, I think you were adding up there.
Yeah, exactly.
And they add up to something very powerful, which is too much of any of those plants in the context of either on their own or even with the animal foods that you're eating can sway, the balance so that you're getting a much less nutritious diet overall.
Earlier on, you talked about 5 or 6 years ago coming to a point along your dietary journey where you included more meat and animal products. Mm-hmm. Was that due to a health crisis or what happened to catalyze that?
No crisis, just getting older. Getting older, being postmenopausal, recognizing that my body wasn't functioning quite the same way, that I needed to retain muscle mass and do some things to build muscle mass. Gaining a little bit of weight, needing to lose it. So I came across the first thing that really started me on that journey was just simply looking at the difference between low carb and high carb diets. I'd always been fairly high carb. And so I started to include fewer carbs in my diet. And that really worked for me, more protein. And then I started to research it because I always look into things as I do them or before I do them. And it's kind of blew me away, the learning I got about the nutrient values of these foods. I never really had recognized it before. I kind of understood. My mother always had the mantra, a little bit of everything's good for you. So I was kind of raised with that mantra. But to really understand the role of animal source foods in the diet was a big awakening for me. And really, then a couple of years after that was when I had the idea to write the book, because I noticed how much the debate was leaning towards plant-based and the noise was so loud. And I thought, well, if I had been unaware of the value of animal source foods before, maybe lots of other people are too. And so that's what started me down the path of thinking needed to write a book. And there were a few other sort of triggers as well, but that was one of them.
You highlighted that point there, the fact that there is so much noise in the narrative right now when it comes to the benefits of eating plant-based. Where does all that stem from, and how long has it been happening?
If you got 5 hours, we could talk about this.
Let's get into it.
I do get into this in part 3 of my book. And the way I describe it is that there are a bunch of influencing factors and influencing parties out there. They're not all acting and singing from the same song sheet because they're scripted or because they, they're in cahoots with one another or anything like that. It's not that kind of conspiracy. It's more that they have it's a confluence of those factors, and parties all have a similar aligned set of interests. So they all have an interest in the plant-based diet succeeding. So, for instance, you can take food corporations who see the big marketplace, right? This is opening up a brand new market-enhancing possibility for them through vegan processed foods, and we've seen those hit the shelves, right, over the past 5 years. You've then got science itself, for which there's a kind of publish or die mentality in science, in epidemiology. And you have to sort of publish within the topic area and along the lines that corporations find palatable, because that's where the funding often comes from. So you've got that natural inclination in science to keep repeating studies that pop up with plant-based favorable conclusions. Now, I say that, and we can get into this a bit later if you like. They don't actually come up with those conclusions. They pretend to come up with those conclusions, because when you dig below the surface of that science, it very often doesn't say what it says it says. So the case is certainly not clear cut in favor of plant-based when you look at epidemiology, not at all. You then have something, you have the influence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is, a lot of people have never heard of that church. They don't see it in their lives. They don't see any signs for it. It just never ever impacts them, or they think it doesn't impact them. But in fact, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which was founded in 1863, has throughout history had a very strong impact on dietary advice and dietitians' thinking, dietitians' textbooks. And it's a very anti-meat philosophy in that church. It stems from their belief that people need to be eating the Garden of Eden diet, which was ordained by God, and it does not include meat. And meat eating leads to dangerous and sinful behaviors, and those must be eradicated. So, when we look at the Dietary Guidelines Committee of the United States, which is pretty anti-saturated fat and anti-meat and very pro-grains and vegetables, and has been for decades, it is very heavily influenced by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. There are actual representatives on the board, on the committee. So, that's a kind of influence that most people, as I say, would not be aware of, but it's definitely having an impact. So, Mayor Adams of New York is very pro plant-based, as you're probably aware. He's pushing that through hospitals and through public institutions in New York. He's given a lot of credence to and some positions of responsibility to an organization called ACLM, American College of Lifestyle Medicine, which has its origins in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So you can see how a supposedly, small rinky-dink, some people might say, church is having a really big influence on what's on our plates, right? I could go on. I think that the media then adds another layer to this, because they love to publish in line with the zeitgeist. They love those media headlines which catch your attention, clickbait. They don't look below the surface. They don't interrogate data. They don't interrogate studies. And if they did, they would find, as I say, that those studies don't always say, and in fact, rarely say what they purport to say. So the media is guilty by way of its, shall we say, it's just going along for the ride and not doing its job, not interrogating enough. And you add all those things together, and you get really a very, very powerful set of forces. And it creates this groupthink. And then the groupthink itself becomes a thing. It becomes like an independent factor, right? Once something gets a hold of people's minds, the zeitgeist, groupthink, whatever you want to call it, it's so difficult to break that down. You get called crazy, you get called unscientific. These are the kind of things that have been leveled at me in the past couple of years, because how can she say that? It's just it beggars their belief.
And when it comes to the 3 different pieces we opened up with, I think for the health piece, that one would be a bit trickier to push on people. But the environment, quickly, if you say that to somebody, they can understand where that logic is coming from and the ethics. So it's going to naturally fit with people's paradigm if they don't take time to do the digging and get into the work that you do, that type of work.
Yeah, absolutely. The fact that they have these 3 legs, the health, the environment, and ethics, makes for this, what I've sometimes referred to that as a 3-legged stool. It's pretty hard to kick over a 3-legged stool. If you take one of those legs out, you can kick it over pretty quickly. But the 3 legs mean it's very hard to kick over, very hard to argue against, because you got to do it on all fronts. And in a way, that's why my book was so long, and why, in a way, it's a generalist book, because what I had to do was take into account so many topics in each of those 3 areas, to pick them apart, to help people to understand, the very detail and the nature of those arguments. And I called upon experts all along the way. People like, I saw that you'd done an interview with Dr. Lyon about protein.
Yeah.
You've interviewed Dr. Lustig. He's a famous, esteemed endocrinologist, knows all about sugar, fructose, the influence of that, and processed food. Now, these are the experts, and I was only coordinating and corralling their expertise to try and build this argument to counter the 3-legged stool, as it were. And in that sense, it's a general book, and I am a generalist. I make no apology for that, because I think we needed to look at all of these areas.
Well, as you speak of yourself as a generalist, I can relate as somebody who's interviewing these guests each and every week. I mean, for yourself and me, as we do that, we're naturally going to learn a lot and become experts, but we're a medium that's helping corral these people and this information and hopefully bring it to people in a way that's digestible and they can take action on it. And your book and this show, I think, are very similar in that realm.
Yeah, I've seen from your guest list, it's very true. I think you're right. Yeah. And it was recently, the past couple of years since the book came out, actually it's 18 months, I wondered, am I reaching that audience? Am I making it okay for people? Because a lot of my support has come from what I would call the converted already. People on Twitter who already kind of believed what I believe, and they've been great supporters to me. Podcasters who have open minds, great supporters. There's been a lot of pushback as well, though. But one of my greatest satisfactions was this past September, the book won an award, which was for the Guild of Food Writers, and it won the Food Investigation Award. And to me, that said that I had reached the mainstream. Normally, the writers that win these awards from this organization, they're mainstream cooks. They're writing about food culture. They're not looking at the politics of food, which is really what my book is doing. And I thought, well, that's a really brave thing to give me that, because they could have got themselves into some hot water by doing so. They might have offended a few people, but they chose to support it. And there were a bunch of chefs in the room who were supporting it. And that was terrific, to know that I'd reached that kind of audience.
Well, congrats on that. I'm happy to hear. And it
Thank
makes
you.
sense. The book is
Thank you.
amazing. And I think with anything like this, where there's two polar opposite views and a lot of friction in between, we'll call it, it takes time. And your book is a brick that has been now
Yeah.
laid, and you're continuing to do the work by coming on shows like this. And, and I like to think of the work I do as a brick as well. And we're continuing to work together and put the information out there because there is, as you stated, there is so much competing against us, and we're competing against what has become the common narrative. So it's going to take time. I just wanted to
Yeah.
throw that in there. We got to be patient, keep doing the
I
work we're
agree.
doing, and it's very important.
Yeah, I agree. And not get downhearted, because every day there'll be something to counter what we're trying to do and trying to say. I've seen in the past 18 months some really positive developments and some less positive ones, but I'm trying to convince myself that there are more positives than negatives in what I see going on around me in the discussion and in food culture.
One of the big challenges I think we face in bringing this different narrative are common documentaries, game changers. You talk
Mm-hmm.
about these in your
Mm-hmm.
book that are pro plant-based, pro vegan. And in today's world, most of us are very busy. We don't have time to get deep into the research and figure out. And even if you do, there's going to be, combative information in there, and it's very hard to figure out. So for a lot of people, understandably, the best we can do is watch a documentary like Game Changers
Mm-hmm.
and feel like, because they are done so well and are very convincing, feel like we're making a good choice to put our flag in the ground and stand behind that. And the other layer I'll put on that too is the fact that as human beings, we lack a lot of control in our world, and making this dietary choice is an area that we can influence, and we can influence it very quickly by making significant changes over a
Mm-hmm.
short period of time.
Yeah, you hit a bunch of nails on the head there. The whole game changers phenomenon, and I do call it a phenomenon because it had such a spectacular influence on particular groups of people, younger people in particular. That was one of the instigators, the triggers for me writing the book, because I saw what was going on there. I saw the money that was put behind that movie, the professionalism of it, the slickness of it. And yet, when you analyze the studies, Tim Reese is a great dietitian, and he did an analysis. I don't know if you're aware of it, a 3-part analysis of every single study that was in that movie. And did it actually say what Game Changers said it said? And not a single one did. So people are being fooled. And unfortunately, that is the way documentaries are made these days, and probably people would accuse documentaries on the other side of being the same, but there aren't very many of those. There aren't very many pro-meat documentaries right now, or pro-farming, for instance. There's a new one out. I guess you may or may not have it on your radar, but it's the one about the blue zones, which is Dan Buettner, I think is how I say his name. And it's on Netflix, and it's very popular. And it's plant-based with a disguise, right? Because they're looking at people who live a long time, till 100, in particular parts of the world, and they're trying to look at what they have in common. And of course, there are loads of things that they have in common. Sunshine for one, community for another, local food, etc., etc. The thing that this documentary finally hones in on is they eat plant-based food, mostly plant-based. So now we're dealing with another angle that they're throwing, which is to live a long time. The evidence says eat plant-based. Well, the evidence doesn't say that, because if you actually go to the blue zones and you look at what they're eating, it certainly is not a plant-based diet. They have goats on spits, lambs on spits. This is their treat every Sunday, to have a huge animal rotating and everybody digs in. If you've ever gone to Spain, Italy, Croatia, and tried to get a whole grain rice or bread, you just won't find it. It's white bread all the way, right? Beautiful, crusty, white French bread or ciabatta or whatever. So this whole Blue Zones plant-based diet thing is completely fabricated, but it's a lovely idea, right? It's very simple. People love it. I saw Goldie Hawn promoting it the other day, and I thought, oh, God, we're really sunk now if Goldie Hawn is promoting the Blue Zones movie, because it's such a lovely thing to think. So you're right that these things are constantly coming out, and we just have to keep on going, keep on questioning them.
You mentioned Dan there. He's actually been on the show a couple times.
Has he?
And one thing I'm careful to do with this show is not get pigeonholed and closed-minded and just bring on guests of one philosophy when it comes to diet and lifestyle. So, and I'll continue to do that. It's important to me to pull pieces from everybody. And I think, even somebody like Dan, who I don't fully stand behind everything his message states, there's still value there. And it keeps an open dialogue and keeps us thinking critically and brings all the information forth in a way that people can make their own decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's laudable and that's great. You should be hosting a variety of views, and at the same time, people should be able to state their very strong view. So I guess, and then people can judge.
You stated something there when it came to the Blue Zones, the fact that the data itself isn't accurate because they are actually having meat there. And secondarily, the fact that there's more variables than just the diet, and that seems to be a big piece, at least, of what gets honed in on. So
absolutely. To
me, there's two different levels to that. And the fact that you don't see that Blue Zones data critiqued very often, and it's just accepted. When you put it the way you did there, it's interesting.
Yeah, and there's another layer. You like layers, so I'm going to give you a third layer on the Blue Zones, which is the data about the centenarians is also corrupted. So a couple of analyses have been done showing that they actually miscounted the number of centenarians because of the records that they were keeping, and that there weren't as many in certain places as they previously thought. So it may not be that living in a certain way in Croatia or southern Italy actually leads more people to live to 100. So the data is quite corrupt at many levels, but as you say, it's a nice story and there's some good elements to it. And I certainly think that there are some elements of Blue Zone countries, particularly around the Mediterranean, that we need to be emulating. For instance, they really do eat much less processed food than we do. So they've got a whole food diet. The rate of processed food consumption, I think, is about 55% of our calories in the UK. It's about 60% of US calories are ultra-processed food. In France and Italy, it's like 15%. So that alone might explain some of the health benefits and the longevity benefits that we're seeing in those countries.
And coming back to the Seventh-day Adventists, isn't one of the Blue Zones in California somehow tied to them?
Yes, it is the Loma Linda community is one of the zones that they talk about. And they are a community that doesn't believe in drinking alcohol. They don't smoke. They're not overweight. They don't eat meat. So which of those factors is actually generating their health benefits and their longevity? And that whole, what we call healthy user bias, infiltrates so much of the epidemiology that is used to condemn animal foods or omnivore diets. And your listeners will be very familiar, I think, with what that is, the healthy user bias. But basically, it means that you can't, when you've got a particularly healthy population being studied, if they're doing lots of healthy things and they're not eating meat, then it's very hard to pick those apart and get an unbiased picture of what it is that is driving their health benefit.
You used a word there, epidemiology.
Mm-hmm.
And this ties back to something you were saying we could probably get into later on in the conversation, where the data of these studies may not be that great. So talk about what that means when the study is epidemiological or observational, and what that means for the quality.
So, yeah, an observational study looks at a given population retrospectively or prospectively, but it is only looking at what they do. It's not changing anything that they do. It's not like a controlled trial where you feed them one thing, you feed one group one thing and one thing another, and then you measure it over a certain period of time. No, it's not that. They are simply looking at patterns. And so they will take two groups of people and try and discover what is driving, say, a higher rate of heart disease in one versus the other, and try and associate those heart disease occurrences with whatever it was that those people happen to have eaten over the past 20 years, right? So the fact that it's observational is one issue. The other issue is that usually they base their data on one point of information about diet, which is a food frequency questionnaire taken right at the beginning. So how much of this did you eat last week? How much of that did you eat last week? They then use that to create a baseline, and they assume that that is going to apply throughout the entirety of the study. Now, it very rarely does. And so we can't really trust the input data. If the study is saying people who eat more vegetables are, 0.98, have 0.98 of the risk of a heart attack as people who eat fewer vegetables, we don't actually know if those people have actually eaten that number of vegetables all the way through their lives. We have no idea. So the data is slightly corrupted. And then the third thing that we tend to find with epidemiology is it comes up with relative risks, which in any other field would be laughed out of town, right? So I just mentioned a risk factor of 0.98. It might go the other way. So people who eat meat have 1.02 times the heart attack rates of people who don't eat meat, okay? 1.02. Now, compare that with, say, the impact of smoking, where people who smoke have 20 to 30 times the risk of getting lung cancer than people who don't. 1.02 versus 30 times. It beggars belief that we even look at the 1.02. And in fact, there's a criteria which is called the Bradford Hill criteria, which says you really should not consider anything to be causal unless it has a risk ratio of 2 times or more. None of these epidemiology studies do. None that I've come across. I mean, if anyone can find me one, I'd love to see it, but they don't. It's all these tiny little risks that we just shouldn't be paying attention to.
So when it comes to nutrition, you've made the case for these observational studies and why they're not really worth their weight in anything. But is there good data like RCTs where there are two groups comparing different diets? Like, where do people turn? If this data is not good, do we have the data that's done properly to really figure this out?
We have very few RCTs on actual diets. We did, though, for instance, we had back in the day, the Minnesota coronary study, for instance, was done, which it was done on a population which you wouldn't be allowed to do that on today, which was actually manipulating the diets of people who were in mental hospitals. So you would never be allowed to do that, but they did it. And the conclusions of that study were quite definitive. they showed that, for instance, reducing saturated fat did not improve heart outcomes, cardiovascular disease outcomes. In fact, in some ways, it made it worse, and other outcomes, mortality was increased, right? Overall mortality. That was a pretty definitive vote in favor of saturated fat as opposed to polyunsaturated fat. And yet, despite that, despite the Sydney Diet Heart Study, despite the Women's Health Initiative, which both concluded the same thing, we've had 4 decades now of people telling us that saturated fat is bad for us. So things take a long time to die. Once something gets hold of the public imagination and public health authorities, it's pretty hard to overturn it. God love them, people keep coming up with studies exonerating saturated fat, for instance. But they, the belief still persists. The American Heart Association still persists in advising against saturated fat intake, which then leads us to reduce our intake of red meat, for example, because of the saturated fat. So it all has knock-on effects. I think that the most promising research for me is what I would call mechanistic research. So if somebody can put forward a plausible mechanism via which a given food causes a particular illness, disease, chronic disease, I think that's worth paying attention to. And then some RCTs could maybe be done on a small scale around those. I'm thinking, I know you've had Dr. Lustig on, and his new book, Metabolical, for instance, is chock full of mechanistic data. He explains why a particular ingredient or a particular process in ultra-processed food processing will have a given effect on the body, down to the cellular effect. That to me is very convincing, and that's the kind of stuff I tend to believe. As for the wider population who won't read that stuff, or who don't have the time or the interest, I honestly think there are only two things they need to do: eat real food, balanced amount of real food from all kinds of food groups, fruits, vegetables, meat, animal foods, eggs. Get it from the best organic sources that you can. Ignore every single piece of epidemiological research that gets reported in the paper. Simply rip it up and throw it away.
Okay. So that kind of highlights everything there in 2 key points.
That would be it. And Dr. Fred Provenza and I have chats about this. He's an animal behaviorist. He was a professor at Utah. He's written a book called Nourishment. He's a great thinker on these things. And we were musing on the fact that actually, if people just did that, if they just ate real food, didn't cut out too many things from their diet, too many types of food from their diet, and ignored guidelines, we just wouldn't need guidelines. We wouldn't need the dietary guidelines of America, or we wouldn't need what we have in this country, the Eat Well Guide, because people would be fine.
And I think we need a very simplistic approach to at least get people on board, and then down the line they can get into the nuances, because
sure, what
must happen with so many people with all the different conflicting information out there is they just throw their arms up and say, I'm not even going to try because I'm confused, and there's people saying bad things about every way of eating, and I don't have the time, and what's the point if people are going to knock every different diet out there? So I feel for people. I say this all the time. I really feel for people.
I feel for people, and I don't know, what is the best way to help them. I think getting back to what you said earlier, trying to provide these kind of formats for people so that they can get a quick soundbite about what might be wrong or right about certain studies to help them filter it. But I really do wish that the message could be simplified down in government to eat real food, keep your packaged food intake to maximum 10% of your calories. That's it. That kind of simple message would be good for people. Then you get into, if a person has a given condition that they really need to fix, a particular thing that bothers them, they have to dig deeper, but then they are motivated. They are motivated to dig deeper. If a person has psoriasis, all over body eczema, bipolar, anything that is chronic, they will look into the kind of diet. Hopefully, they will be prompted to look into the diet that will help them. Very often, those conditions lead them towards the carnivore diet, which is a whole other thing, which is, it's not a diet that I follow, but it's a diet I respect because I've seen the good it does for people.
And in your book, you do write a small chapter on the carnivore diet.
Yeah.
So for people that this might be brand new to, talk about what that is and why it might be beneficial.
So carnivore diet is only animal source foods. So it's meat, fish, dairy, eggs. Then you have that's in its purest form. You then have some carnivores who are quite flexible, and they'll throw in some blueberries or some honey. I know that Dr. Paul Saladino now adds a bit of honey into his diet, for instance. It's really about what works for a person's health. So they're not dogmatic about it. It's not a religion. They're not trying to get everybody to do it. They don't think the whole world should be that way. It's purely about their health, the health of their communities, their carnivore communities. There have been some studies as to whether you can get all of your nutrients from a carnivore diet. And Dr. Zoe Harkim did a very good one that's available on her website. If anybody wants to look it up, she said you can get almost everything out of a really well-planned carnivore diet. And there are certain things which we think carnivores would miss, but they don't seem to miss. So for instance, how do you get vitamin C? Well, carnivores don't seem to have the same need for vitamin C because they're not consuming carbohydrates of any kind, right? There's no bread in there. There's hardly any fruit. So they don't have the same need because it's not being depleted in the same way. So there are lots of nuances to do with the nutrition of that diet. It's not for everybody, and certain people would find it very boring, including myself. I would find it very boring not to be able to have broccoli with my steak, for instance. But it works for some people, and I think that's the whole point about diet is there's no one size fits all, and we cannot be prescribing to whole communities or indeed the whole world that they eat the same way.
I'm glad you brought up that vitamin C piece because it just brings forward the idea that this is very nuanced. And if you're going to look at a diet like the carnivore diet, you can't just pick one piece of it and try and extrapolate that, whether it be vitamin C or the iron content. When the diet changes on such a massive level like that, it needs to be looked at within that context.
Absolutely. I agree. I think the carnivores face a very uphill challenge, though, because if you think about it, omnivores are facing challenges because of the environmental concerns. We're being told that our diet is not ethical in the environmental sense. Can you imagine the flack that a carnivore gets when they go out to dinner with people and all they're eating is meat? They're really facing a barrage of criticism in people's heads, I would imagine.
Well, we're going to get into that in a little bit here. First, I want to talk about your diet, coming back to your pivot there a few years ago, where you part of that was that you brought down your carb load. And we've talked about carnivore now. I'm curious how you feel about an in-between, like a ketogenic diet, and if that's something you've played around with or advocate for.
I'm a big fan. I did it quite strictly for about a year, again, to help deal with a bit of weight gain and also just as an experiment to get more protein in my diet. And it worked for me. I guess I didn't have the discipline to stick to it longer term, and I didn't feel I needed to. But I am a big fan. And again, it's one of those diets that I have seen work really, really well for people to resolve health conditions. So there is no question that the ketogenic diet has therapeutic benefits for epilepsy, for instance. That is now very well acknowledged in the literature. Also for the treatment of autistic symptoms and helping people to manage those symptoms and to lessen imbalance. I've also seen it work with people that I know in treating cancer. So to me, it's a very, very promising diet. And I think it has therapeutic benefits. It also makes a lot of people feel great. It's good for the control of diabetes. So there's lots of good. And again, you have to be aware of what the press says, because there's a lot of stuff on the internet that says that the keto diet will kill you. I think you then, if you get that stuff popping up on your feed, you then need to look for the opposite to dissect that. And there's some great videos done by Dr. Eric Westman, who every time one of those bogus studies comes up about the keto diet, he does something called Dr. Westman Responds. Have you seen that? It's a great
he's been
thing.
on the show
funny.
too.
Has he? So he just does it in this amazingly relaxed, considered, unjudgmental way, and he gives you the facts. So I think that the facts are out there if you look for them. If you're a bit scared of the keto diet, you wonder what it'll do to you, just check in with Dr. Westman and he'll help you.
That fear piece, I think that's a really important point, because as we're molding this conversation and navigating through, we're realizing that basically everything is working against people when it comes to making a shift and going against this common narrative, including that, to make a dietary switch like that and to do a Google search and find people talking about how horrible doing that could be, it's another obstacle for people to jump over, along with the dietary guidelines, along with the documentaries, along with common narrative when people are talking with their friends. And again, the plant-based narrative is now commonly accepted as the best way for multiple reasons, for health, environment, things that we're going to discuss today. So there's just so many things working against people. So hopefully, again, a conversation like this can begin to unravel that and bring new ideas to the conversation.
Yeah. Well, this is what you're describing is the con. A con is big and strong, right? And that's what we're seeing, the con. And in a way, people say, why did you call your book something so controversial and so inflammatory? I did it to alert people to the fact that there is something big going on, something that is messing with the information you're getting. I thought it was really important to put that stake in the ground and not to dance around it in any way, because as you've just summarized, it's big and it's powerful. And if people want to make independent decisions, they have to be aware of that power.
If you're enjoying the episode, take a second and let me know by clicking like and subscribe below. Thank you so much. And now back to the episode. Earlier, you mentioned the saturated fat piece. I think it's important we get into this, even though there is a lot of conversation, luckily now, debunking this and providing that ulterior narrative that it isn't bad and something we need to fear. But let's go back and talk about the history of where that came in. The way I understand it, it's Ansel Keys, and you talk about him and his story in your book. But let's go back to the beginning, where this became a thing and how it's played out since.
Well, I mean, I'm not the expert on saturated fat. I think that the two people that have done so much research into this are Nina Teicholz and Gary Taubes, both of whom wrote big tomes on the origins of this belief that saturated fat was bad for us and where that went. So I really only came into the story briefly at the point of Ansel Keys, who originally came up with the notion that cholesterol in the diet was going to cause cholesterol in the body to rise, and that was going to lead to heart conditions, heart attacks, etc. Let's just call it CVD, just for short. He then changed that theory and began to believe that cholesterol itself wasn't really doing much, and in fact, later in his career, said as much. He said he'd come to believe that cholesterol was not an issue. So it swapped over to saturated fat causes cholesterol in the body to rise, which causes CVD. Now, he pushed that theory. He got the ear of the American Heart Association. He got the ear of government, the dietary guidelines committees. They all bought into this idea, maybe because it was a simplistic idea, maybe because it was the only one being pushed with such vehemence, maybe because Keyes managed successfully to sideline people who had other ideas. John Yudkin, who believed that sugar was really the bigger culprit, and Dr. Mann, who said that the diet heart hypothesis linking saturated fat to heart disease was just the biggest con ever. Those men were silenced. And somehow, through force of personality or through other means, Keyes got his view into the mainstream. And once it got a hold of the mainstream, it never let go. So I mentioned earlier those studies, Minnesota, Sydney, and Women's Health Initiative. All of those were done in the late 60s, 70s. We had the information to overturn this belief that saturated fat was the culprit in our diet. But by then it seemed the organizations who were supporting that view had already staked their claim on this theory, and they weren't going to let it go. It doesn't matter that all the evidence came up to disprove it. And that's been going on for decades now. Can you imagine the American Heart Association standing up now and saying, do you know what? For 50 years, we've been wrong, been telling you the wrong stuff. Here you go. Here's the new theory. They're just not going to do that. So we're in this terrible situation where these organizations that we should be trusting on these very big topics, we can't really trust because we know they're entrenched. They're immovable. They can't lose institutional face, as it were. So they're not going to change their mind. That's not a very positive spin on it. But I think that you are right, that there's so much research to the contrary now that it really doesn't take much for people to find it and to say, okay, yeah, saturated fat's probably not the thing I should be scared of.
So by the sounds of it, it's ego getting in the way of unveiling this newer information.
I believe it's institutional ego and also money. So they've already pumped money into a lot of the scientists who are proving these things, who are seeking to prove against saturated fat. Once that money flows that way, it's quite hard to get it flowing the other way.
It's so interesting because, the people that are running these organizations are just people, and they make mistakes like all of us. And it's
Absolutely.
Like, to me, there's nothing wrong with saying I was wrong. And I think there's actually a lot of merit behind that and vulnerability and connection to change a perspective. And I've done that a number of times over the years and been open about it. And a lot of people do. So it's interesting that certain organizations or people hold so tightly on to their beliefs.
I think maybe a changing of the guard of a particular type helps. So the American Diabetes Association was dead set against low-carb diets for a long time. And they were very much in the low-calorie kind of camp for control of diabetes, right? And moderation and, eat cake, but only in small amounts, that kind of thing. It took a long time for the low-carb message to filter through, and then it did. And then it did because they had to change it at the top of the organization, and she embraced it. She embraced low-carb as a valid, viable way of controlling diabetes. So, you have to hope that that's going to take place in some of these other organizations. There'll be one brave person who comes in at the top who says, you know what, it's time to call time on that.
Earlier, you talked quickly about cancer, and another one of the big myths that seems to continue to propel itself is the fact that consuming meat, red meat, processed meat, is linked to cancer. And I think that's a big scare for a lot of people who want to embrace a lower carb lifestyle and diet. What's the research showing there?
So the research is showing mixed things. Some very famous research came out the year I was starting to write the book. It was in the Annals of Internal Medicine. It was a series of 5 studies coming out of McMaster University. You probably remember it, caused a big uproar because they concluded that on balance, there was no reason to recommend against current levels of consumption of red and processed meat. In other words, the studies were not showing great harm, and the studies in any case were, in most cases, of low quality and low certainty. So we shouldn't be changing the way we eat on the basis of such work. So that's on the one hand. Then you have the WHO study, which was 2015, I believe, where they came out really against processed meat in particular, but red meat as well, and said that they said red meat was probably carcinogenic, and processed meat was certainly carcinogenic. That, I think, is when you say people are scared, I think that WHO study was the scary thing. I think that's the thing that people still talk about today. People bring it up all the time. It gets repeated in other studies going forward, so it gets perpetuated. The reality is that study, the WHO, which is supposed to be definitive, is not nearly as definitive as is claimed. And there's a piece of analysis that I would direct your listeners to, which is done by Dr. Georgia Eade. It's available to read on her website. I can't remember the name of it, but she dissects that study piece by piece and shows us that actually the scaremongering should not be taken that seriously. The other thing that really convinced me about the weakness of that study was listening to one of the members of the committee who served there, which was Dr. David Klurfeld, who is part of the which department? Department of Agriculture. Forgive me, I can't remember, but he's pretty high up in the food echelons in the United States. And he was one of the 15 members of this committee that came out with the recommendations against red and processed meat. And he said it was the most frustrating professional experience of his life because he saw the data being manipulated in a certain way to come up with that conclusion rather than all the data being taken into account in a fair and balanced way. So I think there isn't harm from eating red and processed meat. If there is any harm from processed meat, I think it's very small in terms of the relative risks that are involved.
So we've quickly touched on the processed meat aspect, and there's this other, to me, 2.0 aspect of food quality when it comes to meat and plants, and that's organic, free range. And it'll be interesting over time. Hopefully there'll be studies done that actually compare conventional to these higher quality forms of food.
Absolutely. Well, that work is already being done. So it's really interesting. Dr. Stefan Van Vliet used to be at Duke University. He's now in Utah. He's done a number of studies looking at the impact of the feeding regimen of cattle on presence of omega-3 fatty acid, diminishment of omega-6, because that's also something we want to see, is to get that omega-3, omega-6 balance back to normal. But not only that, the other nutrients, the other phytonutrients, which are present in the meat that comes from animals that are fed on, say, diverse pasture, that's very different than the nutrients that are in grain-fed cattle, for instance. So that is starting to be done. I think there's a really appreciable difference in the nutrient value of those foods.
You mentioned 2 words there together you often don't hear together, phytonutrients and meat. Talk more about how that happens, where animals are consuming certain things and that's actually becomes, which makes sense when you think about it, but becomes part of the meat and the food that we consume.
Absolutely. I mean, it does make sense, doesn't it, that it would end up in the end product. So if an animal is fed on grain, for instance, you will get a high, so this is true of chicken and pigs in particular, the way most of them are raised. There's a very high linoleic acid content because the grain has linoleic acid. So then that transfers to the meat, and that's what you're getting when you're ingesting that meat. As far as the phytonutrients from animals that are fed on varied pasture with a wide variety of forbs and grasses and very rich diet, those phytonutrients, they're what people talk about when they say that vegetables have certain anti-inflammatory qualities or anti-cancer qualities. Again, research is early on that, so it's I wouldn't say it's conclusive, but let's say those qualities really do exist in these phytonutrients. You can get a great many of those in the meat if the animal is eating that varied grass diet. Now, Van Vliet would say you can't get quite as many as eating the plants direct, but you are getting some. So there's a benefit there in terms of anti-inflammatory qualities of the meat that you're eating.
And it's interesting how far back you can take this, where quality of the meat is impacted. And then you can look at that comes from quality of the plants that those animals are eating. And then that can trickle down to quality of the soil. So it's really all connected, and you can follow it all the way to the root of the soil and making sure that soil is of high quality to end up being nutritious in the meat where we can actually process that nutrition.
Yeah. And you're hitting on something there which is really important for people to know, which is nutrients come from the ground into the plants, whether we're eating them or the cow is eating them. But it goes the other way too. So the plant's activity and the quality of the plant's ability to tunnel carbon dioxide and nutrients down through the soil and across through the soil to be shared is also important. So it's very mutual. They give each other different things, the plant to the soil and the soil to the plant. And it's a very, very important part of agroecology or regenerative agriculture, so that recognizes that. I think that is being more recognized. I hear a lot more people talking about farming in that way and about the need to encourage that virtuous cycle that you're talking about. I think it's becoming more common parlance, and that's a really encouraging thing. But the interesting part of this is the role of the cow. So the cow, through munching on the grass in a certain way to the right level, encourages that feeding down into the soil of the nutrients. By trampling on the ground in a certain way, also encourages that process to happen below ground. So when people say that cows are responsible for carbon sequestration, what that really means is the cows are creating the conditions on the ground that enable carbon to go down through the roots and be stored, and also to funnel through the root systems underground. It's not that the cows are gulping in the carbon, they're not making it disappear in that way. They are creating the conditions in the soil whereby that happens.
Got it. So there's two mechanical stresses there: eating the actual grass or plants, and then secondarily, or not secondarily, also the fact that their mechanical stress of stepping on the ground is going to drive that carbon down.
Yeah. And then you get the other thing, which is their poop and their urine, which puts other nutrients into the ground. It's like a fertilizer as well. So that's the other layer, as it were, of how cows are adding to the richness of that soil. The person, I'm very much a generalist on this point, I have to say, but Dr. Christine Jones, if anybody wants to look up her videos online, she'll explain how all that happens. And there are pictures of how it works with the cows trampling and eating and all of those things. So it's pretty good to follow somebody like that.
All right, we're starting to tiptoe into the environmental piece. I want to pull us back into the health piece, and then we're going to get into that in a bit here.
Okay.
The last thing I want to touch on in the health realm is the linoleic acid. You mentioned that quickly, and I think this can be a big piece for people who haven't been necessarily conscious of a lot of their food choices, and this ties to seed oils.
Yeah.
So let's talk more about what linoleic acid is and what oils are good and bad when it comes to cooking and using in, our salads and such.
So linoleic acid is a omega-6 acid. And if we think of omega-6 and omega-3, we're always told that omega-3s are what we need, and that's heart health and bone health and everything else. Omega-6 we also need some of, but we used to have a ratio of about 4-to-1 in our diet, apparently. And now it's about 15-to-1 of linoleic acid to omega-3s. And you need a better balance for functionality. And there are all kinds of things that happen when you get an excess of linoleic acid. And people are just beginning to explore that. But there's indication of oxidation in the cells in the body. There's indication of associations with heart conditions. So it's kind of ironic because we've been told that these linoleic acids, which are found in polyunsaturated oils, are actually good for us. We've historically been told this. So what I mean by polyunsaturated oils are things like sunflower oil, soybean oil. Now, we consume so much of those things now compared to, say, in the 1930s and 40s. Astronomical amounts of those. And that's why the linoleic acid content of our diets has gone up. And that's why the content of our fat tissue has also gone up. So we now know that something like 9% of our fat tissue was linoleic acid historically. It's now 21%. So it's really quite a big change. And the research on this is new. No, it's 20 years old, but there is always emerging research talking about the new effects of this type of acid, fatty acid. One of the things that we need to understand is that forget what goes on inside the body. Outside the body, when you're using it for cooking, it at high heats, it oxidizes very fast, and that creates oxidation in our own bodies. So, for instance, fast food such as French fries in a fast food outlet are always fried these days in something like sunflower oil or soybean oil at high temperature. It's probably that which is causing those foods to be bad for us rather than the frying itself. So they used to be fried in lard, which was an animal fat. And even McDonald's fries were fried in lard, and they tasted bloody marvelous as well as a result. But then they switched over to the sunflower oil or soybean oil. And, you're getting oxidation and toxicity in the very process of creating those French fries because of the breakdown in this type of oil, because of the way it's constructed, the carbons, the different molecules, the way they're put together, it breaks down at these high heats and creates a toxicity.
So when it comes to this huge increase that's now in our bodies, is that primarily through processed foods and fried foods?
I'm guessing it's both of those things, yeah. Because certainly processed foods, you really rarely see an olive oil, for instance, in a processed food. It's always a soybean oil or a sunflower oil. You're really hard pressed to find. It might be a palm oil. That's true these days when in baked goods, palm oil. But yeah, it's processed foods and fried foods, fast foods, which are processed foods, really. They fall into the same category.
Let's extrapolate from the soy oil piece and talk about soy as a whole, because for a lot of people that are in the plant-based world and avoiding meat, that becomes a primary source of protein. So let's talk about some of the complications if somebody is including that in the diet at such a high level.
Yeah, so soy is known to contain isoflavones, which are endocrine disruptors, which simply put means they affect your hormonal system. So in small quantities, I imagine there's no harm going to come. In large quantities, possibly harm will come. So we know what a large quantity of soy milk does to a man, for instance. There's only one case, because I don't think many men drink this much soy milk, but a man who is drinking, I think, 3 liters of soy milk a day grew breasts because of the hormonal changes that the milk had created in him. And then he stopped doing that. And it's quite a famous study. He stopped doing that and he was okay. So clearly, people aren't going to drink that much soy milk, and that would not be good for them. But I still think that's an indicator that this is a food that needs to be moderated. It should be eaten with caution. Interesting experiment was done, I think, in a prison in the Midwest, and this was studied by the Weston Price Foundation. They put certain groups of prisoners on completely plant-based diets with lots of soy elements in them. Again, the hormonal disruption was pretty severe in the men and the women. The women stopped menstruating. The men noticed all kinds of other changes. So they had to revert back to, less soy in the diet and more animal foods in the diet. So those are some indicators. There's also something called, I'm going to mispronounce this probably, but genistein, which is an element of, one variation on the isoflavone, which is recommended only in very small amounts for babies. So children, as you can imagine, are more susceptible to hormonal effects than adults because they're so small. And so the amount that is recommended of genistein per day would be exceeded if a child was fed, say, just 1 drink of soy milk every day. So that's an indication that for children in particular, this is a food source that needs to be looked at with caution. Certainly not, embraced whole hog as the main source of the protein.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't soy formula a pretty common thing?
I believe it is, but I don't know how common. I don't know how many people use it, but I know it's available. Yeah.
And as you talk about this, it brings up for me an interesting piece where, as certain guidelines are dictating that we consume a certain amount of carbohydrates in plant foods, this trickles down as you talk about prisoners, kids in schools. It's not like we have total control, because
absolutely not.
Our kids are going to school, and if they're offering them only plant-based options, or if that becomes the predominant sources to choose from, that becomes a problem as somebody who's tuned into what we're talking about today.
Absolutely. And I think that's why the guidelines matter. That it's because I think something like 40% of institutions in America will be guided by those guidelines in terms of what they can serve. The army, as you say, the schools, the hospitals. And that's why somebody like Nina Teicholz and Nutrition Coalition fights every day for more evidence-based guidelines. I think, Nina would probably say, we'd be better off without any guidelines, better off just eating properly, eating real food and making decisions based on our own bodies. But guidelines are going to be there because of these institutions. And so we better get them right. And it's quite frightening. And the thing is about guidelines too, is that if you're an institution, you're kind of afraid of going against them because you might get sued, you might get into trouble if you're seen to be recommending a diet which is not authorized from above, right? So I think it puts doctors and nurses and dietitians in those hospitals and prisons and whatnot in a very precarious position.
I was going to mention the doctor aspect and the fact that if somebody's, say, tuned into what we're talking about today as a doctor, it's like, how can they go against what they're supposed to recommend?
It's hard. I think they have to be very subtle and very smart. There are a number of doctors like this, but we have a particular brilliant doctor Dr. David Unwin here in the UK, who learned about, say, low carb diets for remission of diabetes. He learned about it from one of his patients. He then built his practice around helping his patients to put their diabetes into remission by following low carbohydrate plans. Did this very successfully, published a paper about it. Did it quietly, I guess. He published a paper, but it didn't get a lot of song and dance in the press. Then suddenly, he starts writing articles in the press about this very thing. Attracts a lot of attention. And he was the subject of quite a big backlash and quite a big retribution campaign, I would say, by people who believed the other way or who believed in other ways of treating diabetes. So he stuck his neck out, and he continues to stick his neck out, and he survives. But I guess you walk the right line, the right side of that line, in what you're asking people to do. And we need doctors like that. We need doctors that question things just enough. We don't want them getting into trouble, but they need to, we need them to be brave and questioning.
Coming back to our soy piece, for somebody, whether they're plant-based or not, and they're consuming a lot of soy right now as a source of protein in their diet, what are some better plant-based options?
I'm not a fan of plant-based protein, as you probably gather, because I think it's so inefficient. I think if I was going to try and get my protein from plant-based foods, I'd be doing a very careful combining of vegetables, rice, beans combinations. So, if you pick your rice and your beans carefully, you can get the balance of amino acids. You have to eat an awful lot of them, though. You have to eat mountains of them. So, if you were getting your protein only from quinoa, I think you need a kilo of quinoa, right? So if you get it from combining beans and rice or different types of beans with different types of vegetables, you can probably get away with fewer amounts. But I think you have to be very good at maths, basically. You have to be adding up your amino acids and making sure you get enough. And you have to be carbohydrate tolerant.
Well, that's where I was going to go, the carb piece. How do you get enough protein without bringing a whole ton of carbs into the equation?
You don't. I just don't think you do. Which is why one of the things I have a chapter which says, what are some of the bad guys in your plant-based diet? Stuff you don't even know that might be in there. So it was the anti-nutrients, which we've already talked about. It was the vegetable oils in the processed foods. And it was also carbohydrates, because I think there's a trap you can fall into. And this may also be one of the reasons why we see certain people fall off the wagon, as it were, with the vegan diet. They can't do it because they can't stand the gastrointestinal distress, which is caused by all the excess in carbohydrates that they have to take in. Some people can stand it, other people can't.
Well, not to mention the weight gain too. I mean, carbohydrates are going to continue to spike blood glucose, spike insulin, and over time, that's going to make a lot of people fat.
Yeah. I think it's going to do one of two things. So it will make some people fat, but there are a lot of skinny vegans and vegetarians too, right? A lot of very slim ones. So I think what's happening there is they're not overloading on the carbs. Therefore, they're probably protein deficient. So I would imagine there's a protein deficiency impacting their muscle mass, other organs and functionality within the body. So you're kind of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you eat enough of those carbohydrate-rich sources to get enough, you'll be getting a big carb load. Or if you don't eat enough, you're not getting enough protein.
Well, I think we've done a good job considering all the information you provide in your book and your knowledge on the health piece of this whole animal-based versus plant-based. Let's continue the conversation into the environment. And we touched on this a little bit with the ruminant animals grazing on the grass, applying that force to the ground, sequestering CO2. But this is probably, I don't know if you have a better idea than me, if the health benefits or the environmental are a bigger push for people to be plant-based. And then we'll continue the conversation into environmental.
I think these days, I would say environmental concerns have the edge. We have such panic now about climate change. We have targets for net zero, which make people, think, how are we going to do this? There's pressure on governments to do it, and governments are feeling the pressure, which is why we have things like the recommendation that Ireland cull 1/3 of its cows, right? Just overnight to get that net zero target for methane down. And we have that going on in New Zealand as well. So these kind of knee-jerk reactions, we've got to get it down, we've got to get it down. That's the kind of pressure we're feeling. And, for lots of reasons, which I can get into, that sort of carbon tunnel vision, I would call it, is leading us down some sticky paths. But it's also our fear of the carbon and the methane, which is created by livestock, is really based on some false information that is peddled and peddled again, and goes round and round, and it's top of mind for people. If we think nutrition is a complex subject, the environmental aspect of this is triply complex. Very hard.
I think a good place to start is let's group together food in general and talk about how big a piece of the pie is the environment when it compares to things like fossil fuels. And then we can split apart the plants and the animals and differentiate.
So let's take United States, for instance. Farming in general, so livestock farming and other kinds of farming, would be about, I'm going to say, 10% of emissions. That leaves 90% for everything else. Transport, energy, construction, all of those industries which are really based on fossil fuels. So, it makes agriculture look like a very small piece of the pie. It's a very similar ratio in the UK. So you'll have agriculture at about 10%, and you'll have transport at 25%, right? Globally, it's 85% of all emissions are generated by things other than, say, animal agriculture. So agriculture itself globally is about 25%. And animal agriculture within that is about 14. Although that has been reduced of late. So the latest report coming out of the FAO says that globally livestock agriculture is responsible for 11% of all emissions. So people who are listening should be getting the picture really that 11%, what's the other 89? What are we doing about that? And even when you talk about methane, for instance, methane has become associated. Methane is one of the greenhouse gases. Just in case I don't want to be too simplistic, but in case people aren't aware, when we talk about carbon emissions targets, we're talking about something called CO2 equivalents, which is made up of methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon, and they're sort of balanced out to be an equivalent rating. So methane is one of those gases, and methane is really associated with cattle. I mean, you probably had this experience where people almost think that cattle are the only things that create methane, and therefore we must get rid of the cows. In fact, cows only generate 15% of the methane that's generated in the world. A lot of the sources are natural sources, wetlands, lakes, rivers, oceans. They are things like landfills, a big source of methane. Industry creates methane. So if we're talking about getting rid of methane, we have a much bigger job on our hands than simply culling the cows or even changing the way we farm the cows. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't change the way we farm the cows, because we can do many things to improve that cycling that we were talking about earlier. We can improve the way animals around the world are farmed, so that that cycle of getting the carbon back into the ground and reducing and counteracting the methane in that way, we can improve that, and we should. But that's a very different thing from demonizing the livestock and saying that they're the sole contributors of methane to the environment.
Okay, we can quickly see there's a lot of nuance to this.
A lot.
But it sounds like when it comes to the environmental impact, is it 11% for animal agriculture? The latest stat?
Globally.
Globally.
That was just out of GLEAM, which is an FAO department. Yeah.
Okay, let's compare now animal agriculture versus plant. I want to make sure I fully understand the nuance here.
I don't have the latest global number for animal versus plant. I know that in the UK, for instance, it will be about 7% to livestock animals, and I'm going to say 4.5 to 5% for plants. So in the US, it's different. In the US, the animals agriculture is responsible for less than half of all of agriculture. So you'll get more in the plant-based and in the plant agriculture.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So
every country is different. Every country is different because of the way they farm, because of what it is they farm, and because of the efficiency with which they farm, and also because of the structure of their economy. So in a lot of third world countries, developing countries, animal agriculture appears to be a huge amount of their emissions because they hardly have any other emissions, right? That's it. They don't contribute very much. In places like the UK and the US, we're very, very industrialized countries. We have a lot of industry. Industry is our primary problem.
All right. Well, the point I'm trying to get to and distill down, because the big argument from vegans is going to be that our food has less emissions, carbon, CO2 emissions. If practices are done to the best capability, how can we compare that? And of course, there's a lot of nuance. What animals, what crops, and again, what part of the world? But what I want to make sure we hammer home in this part of the conversation is if things are done to a certain standard when it comes to animals and plants, and we can use the US as an example, can we get carbon emissions down to zero for both, like with certain practices? Can animal producing animal food versus plant done properly, quote unquote, can we get the animal emissions to the same level as plants or even better?
I believe we can. There are farmers who believe that we can. So there are farms in the US, and it's less well documented in the UK, but there are those farms where they've proven that they can be carbon neutral on their farm. So White Oak Pastures is quite a famous study. It was conducted with Will Harris and his farm in Georgia, and they did a 20-year-long study, and at the end they were looking at whether there was carbon neutrality for his beef, and found that it was actually carbon negative the way it was produced, because it did more for capturing carbon than it did for emitting methane. So individual farmers will say that. We have evidence to that effect. There are a number of studies which are captured by an organization called Soil for Climate. They amass a lot of studies about this carbon neutrality around the world on different farms. What is happening, though, is that people who produce the models which influence government and influence the media and therefore influence the debate, they tend to look at things at a very much higher level. They don't account for the sequestration. They don't believe it. They say it doesn't really happen, or it's it can only happen up to a certain saturation point. And so they attribute many more emissions to animal agriculture than your average farmer would do. And we've had this problem with a particular study. I don't want to get too geeky with study names or anything, but this is a really important study by Poor and Nemecek, which came out about 4 or 5 years ago. And it claimed to look at all kinds of foods all around the world, 135,000 farms, and conclude that meat was producing, 100 kilos of carbon per kilo of product, whereas something like beans would be, 0.2 of a kilo or something like that. So there was a massive damning of animal foods and red meat in particular, by this study. That study has gone on to be used many, many times in other studies. So you get this buildup of evidence, right? And it's very hard to combat that. But when you look at the data in the Poor and Nemecek study, it overstates the acknowledged carbon cost of British beef by 3 times. It probably does that and that's the study I have seen dissecting that. It probably does that for every other country as well, because it's taking the worst offenders. It's not looking at the Will Harrises of the world, their farms. It's looking at the worst offenders and taking the numbers from those and using that for a global study. And that's why global studies say one thing, farmers say another, and we really need to start looking at the commonality between those things. And I think that policymakers need to pay a lot more attention to what the farmers are saying, and that on the ground evidence about what's possible to achieve.
I'm just picturing a vegan listening in and entering this part of the conversation. I want to make sure, again, we're clear on this. We'll use best case scenario. And the common argument you're going to hear is that if you include animal products in your diet, you're having a greater environmental impact. We've already clearly stated the health benefits of including animals, but when it comes to environment, can we get a better result, or at least neutral, when it comes to farmers that are farming animals versus plants? Do you get what I'm saying? I want to be clear on when we leave this part that there is no environmental, if this is true, benefit to only farming plants.
Well, there is an environmental benefit. Let's say there may be an environmental benefit if you're talking about only carbon. Now, there was a study again in the US that came out 2016, which did a study of what would happen to US emissions if all animal foods were removed from the diet for all Americans. And they concluded that, yes, emissions would go down by about 2.5%. Okay. That's not nothing, but it's not very much. And they concluded also that in the process of achieving those lower emissions, we would see many nutrient deficiencies, right? So we'd be missing certain amino acids, certain vitamins, and that would be across the population. So you have to factor that into this carbon question. So then the next step should be, okay, so if we don't want those nutrient deficiencies, we'd have to grow more of those crops to meet those, if we even could, because there's some nutrients you can't even get, right? Let's say we grew more of those crops, took up more land to grow the crops. You can pretty soon see that the 2.5% gain in emissions would be lost by the growing of more crops to meet those nutrient deficiencies. Am I being at all clear?
No, this is nuanced, and you're explaining it very well, and this is important. So if we make more plants, grow more plants to fill in the nutritional void of taking away animals, and then we start comparing carbon, we're going to be even higher. Then
we may be higher, we may be equal. I don't know. I don't know what but the gap, 2.5% reduction that we would have achieved it would easily be lost by the need to produce these other forms of nutrients. Something else to factor in, we shouldn't only be thinking about carbon, or CO2, I should say. We should also be thinking about biodiversity, about soil health. Those are other elements of the environment that we need to be protecting. What would happen to soil health if animals were removed from the land and we were using only nitrogen fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, to produce monocrops in enough quantity to feed people? What happens to the soil then? It gets more depleted than it already is, right?
Well,
and
you
eventually,
took the words out of my mouth. I was going there next. So take that story even further. What happens down the line over generations?
Well, I think what happens is, David Montgomery writes about civilizations that have been lost, because the minute you lose your soil, you lose life, you lose your civilization. And this has happened throughout history. We would be in danger of that happening again if we continue to overuse chemical fertilizers on our land without the replenishment that comes from regenerative forms of agriculture and from animals on the land. You need those animals, you need them. The other thing is diversity, biodiversity. How do you get that if you're growing crops with chemical inputs across large swathes of the land in order to feed people because you don't have any protein from animal sources? How do you get biodiversity? You don't, because monocrop farming is completely antithetical to biodiversity. You're killing a lot of small animals, the birds, the bees, because of the way those products are farmed. So for me, the only way forward is a kind of is an approach to agriculture which is holistic, which people call agroecology. People call it regenerative agriculture. There are a number of references. All of them are nuanced, a little bit different. But what they mean is looking at the ecosystem as a whole and factoring in how all those parts work together. And animals are an essential part of how that ecosystems must work.
Before we leave this and go into ethics, let's give you a hypothetical situation here. And say you're at a party, you're feeling a little bit feisty, and a vegan comes up to you and says, I am on this diet for environmental reasons. And again, you've given a ton of nuance, but what would your quick answer be to why that point specifically doesn't make sense?
I'm not very good at this dinner party, cocktail party chat. I've got to tell you, I can very rarely come up with the one sentence when it comes to environmental stuff. And I'm thinking out loud here.
But do they stand a chance with that argument? Again, we've talked about the fact that if you grew only plants, you'd bring the carbon emissions up. But I just want to make sure we're clear on this part. If somebody is using this as their sole reason of not eating animals, why they need to consider otherwise?
I think that what I would probably do is I would ask them, okay, what is their primary reason for thinking that animal agriculture is bad for the environment? They would most likely come back and say, the methane, right? Because that's what people do. And I would tell them the story of methane then. And I would say all the ways that methane from cattle, and this is not one sentence, but I might do it in 5 sentences, all the ways that methane from cattle is vastly exaggerated. And you and I haven't even talked about all the ways, but we've talked about, the 11% versus the 89%. But we haven't talked about the fact that the way the metrics that are used favor industry and condemn animal agriculture. There's a metric called GWP star or GWP 100, And at the moment, GWP 100 is being used, and it overstates the emissions from cattle by about 3 to 4 times. It overstates the warming effect. So there are a number of ways in which methane is exaggerated. And then I would talk about the fact that animals on that the land cannot survive without animals on it, and we would end up with desertified land that is dry and brittle, that has no nutrients in it, because the animals are essential for keeping that land, keeping the moisture in the soil, keeping the nutrients in the soil, keeping the carbon in the soil. Now, if that person's still standing next to me, I'd maybe go get them another drink and take them and give them an hour. But they've probably gone by now.
Oh, that's a great answer. All right, let's move into the ethics piece. The last major reason why people would adopt a plant-only diet. Mm-hmm. And you quickly touched on, I think it was when you addressed monocrops, the different species that are impacted negatively and killed off by that. Mm-hmm. But for somebody that's saying, I want to eat only plants and do no harm to any animals, let's talk about why there's a lot of gray in there.
There's a huge amount of gray in there. I mean, I think what most people don't realize until it's pointed out to them is that to farm crops, you need to kill some or a great many animals. And when you have monocrop farming, you kill a great many animals because you have to clear the land of the mice, the rodents. The foxes have to disappear, and they go off and they can't find anything to eat. You can't allow deer on your land when you're farming crops. The use of the chemical inputs kills the bees, the insects, which then means the bird population dies or diminishes. So I guess I would ask whoever is considering that to say, well, why is it more important to save the life of a cow or a chicken than it is to save the life of the bees and the birds that populate our rural landscapes? Is it because the cow is bigger and we can see it and it has a cute face? Is it because we just don't think about things like birds and mice? But really, we should have a moral. We know that all agriculture is going to kill some animals because to eat is to kill. Something must die for us to eat, no matter what it is that we eat. And we need to be at least aware of the judgments we're making about what must die. Because you do have blood on your hands either way, and you just have to make the choices. And there are those who would say it's more moral to kill one cow than the hundreds and hundreds of animals that would be killed in the course of producing your plant-based diet. You could live off that one cow for an entire year versus all the other animals that might die. So I think we need to be careful about our morality and what rules we're applying to that morality, and how consistent we're being. But to be honest, I've had this conversation with many people, and this is something that works at a cocktail party in the sense that when you mention that animals do die for your crops to get to your table, people are initially shocked, and then you tell them a little bit of a story and they go, oh yeah. So I think people do know it deep down. They just haven't thought about it very much.
Yeah, and there's so many aspects to it. The fact that when you're going to plant a crop, you need to clear whatever is there, exactly, whatever trees and landscape, and animals are going to naturally be in that landscape. And I like the point that I hadn't thought of before, the fact that if you're disrupting, say, even the insects, you have to think further out and extrapolate that out to the birds and the other animals, right, and then what eats the birds. So it's all connected. Like you said, I like the way you worded it. We all have blood on our hands, and accepting that as part of being a human being is just so important, no matter what diet you're going to consume.
Absolutely. And also, it doesn't stop at diet. When we clear the land to build houses, we're killing a whole bunch of animals, right? Because their habitats are disappearing. So human life, forget human eating, human life is displacing animals and killing certain animals. And anyone who can't accept that that is a reality doesn't want human life to exist, really. And the only answer to not impacting the animal world at all is to shrink ourselves to such small numbers with such small lives that you know that we don't impact that animal world. And I don't think that that's possible or advisable. I'm a humanist myself, and I think that humans deserve to be respected, and they deserve to live in a way that helps them thrive as well. And if that sometimes involves animal death, that is just a fact that we have to accept.
And we can't deny the fact that we're all part of this system too. You share a story in your book of, I think it was somebody that was buried in a coffin, and the roots of the tree penetrated, and they were able to scientifically determine that there was no more human cell remains in that coffin. So I mean, we're all part of this
Yeah.
this cascade, this cycle of life, and even when we come to the end of our life, we're going to be put back into it.
Leora Keith tells that story. She's written that beautiful book called The Vegetarian Myth, and she writes better than anyone I know about the circle of life and death. So again, that's another thing. I think I've given your listeners a long list of things to read and look at, but hopefully they'll enjoy that.
That's great. We'll link it all up in the show notes. And Jayne, this
Okay.
conversation's been incredible. Thank you for giving me your time going into each of these buckets and dispelling a lot of myths and providing a different narrative that counters a lot of the mainstream narrative right now. So it gets people thinking, gives them the information to do further research. And I'm going to link up your book, your Twitter, your website, everything in the show notes. And I just want to thank you again for coming on. This was great.
Thank you so much. I love talking to you.
Me too. Thank you. Now that you're done with Jayne, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Dr. Sean. He's a carnivore MD who will teach you how to burn away your visceral fat. I'll see you over there.
Nothing that I'm aware of as a physician whose passion is to help people become the best biological version.